I'm honored to be joined by 3 state leaders for this panel to talk about key components of data use. Today I have with me Kate Akers from Pennsylvania, previously Kentucky, and a part of the Eastern Data Collaborative. I have George Putnam from Illinois and part of the Midwest Collaborative, and Adam Leonard from Texas and part of the Southern Collaborative. So I'd like to get on to our first question. What specifically has been key in your experience for timely and relevant data use at the local workforce or institutional levels? George, I'm going to start this question with you.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay, good. Let me first set some context based on comments from the last panel. We heard both Mark and Tomáš speak about the fragility of key federal indicators of the labor market, and their comments focused on their concern about how well they describe the national labor market. And your question, Jessica, is asking about local. And so if you can imagine the concern about national indicators of the labor market, when in fact those exact same data series are used to describe local, not state, local labor market conditions, my stress level goes a little bit higher. So I'd like to make sure that we keep in mind that there is an important and real urgency to the production, but as you're saying, the use of local workforce information. And as I think about the role of the collaboratives that we talked about yesterday and a part today, the niche that I feel strongly that we can play in the in the national statistical system is in the production and to provide guidance on the use of local workforce information. And I believe our niche needs to be guided by how we understand actionable information. That's a term that Ahu used actually as a part of the panel, but Robert mentioned it this morning and Brian mentioned it as well this morning, and Julia as well. So let me just kind of take through a use case of how I understand what it means to produce actionable information and weave in some of the comments. First, it needs to be relevant. I don't know if I heard correctly this morning, but I felt like I heard one speaker this morning talk about the federal government sharing aggregate statistical tables with the states. That's not going to help. We are interested in and needing, in order to produce actionable local labor market information, we need to be in a place where states and the feds are sharing microdata back and forth. And Anna's soapbox about the IRS is a tremendous thorn in my backside. When when we talk about U.S. wage record enhancement, and we can't sit at a table and tell employers that, yes, we already have actually all the demographics, but we can't match that into our UI wage records because there is federal legislation that doesn't permit it, that's not a very compelling position to be in. If we're asking them to add occupational identifiers, or better yet, could they just add place of work? We don't even know where workers work. And we are in a place of being charged with producing labor market information, and we don't know where workers work. So relevance, I think, is a real key. When we were looking at how to approach the unemployment to reemployment portal during the pandemic, it was really clear, and this was a comment made, I think in the last panel, that Anna made. We were really clear that we needed to talk about claimants. We needed to be able to provide information on claimants, to talk about the composition of claimants, to talk about the movement of claimants through the UI experience, not to talk about the volume of claims, but to talk about the claimant, the individual. And in fact, the GAO report in November of 21 essentially said the same thing, that there was a tremendous gap in the infrastructure because the states have been reporting on claims for decades and not claimants. So that was one piece. We need to make sure that it's relevant. We need to make sure that it's timely, and that came up repeatedly. We collect weekly information on claimants. Mark, to your point, why that doesn't find its way into measures of unemployment is beyond my comprehension. But be that as it may, we get weekly information on claimants. Working with the Coleridge Initiative, ETA releases their claim counts on Thursday mornings. By Thursday afternoon, our people are looking at the composition of claimants from the prior week. There's a lag of 4 days. Timeliness is really important. Why? Because everybody in this room knows that local labor market conditions can be very fluid. And if you're making program administration decisions on resource allocation to intervene and remediate, man, you can't wait 6 months for the QC, for the quarterly UI wage records to come out. All right, so timeliness. So you have relevance, and you have timeliness, and then the third is local. And I'm just going to die on that sword. It's got to be local. The interventions happen at a local level. Resource allocation decisions are made at a local level. And the example that I often use in my presentations that a number of you have heard me bring up again and again, if you look at Illinois and Indiana, less than 1% of claimants are in mining. However, if you look at the southeast corner, 4 counties in Illinois, and the southwest corner of Indiana, about 4 more counties, if you look in that area, 20% of the claimants are from mining. So if there's one thing that economic development, I think, has driven home and well, is the importance of local. And we need to make sure that our statistical infrastructure reflects that. So I would answer that question by saying actionable information, understanding actionable as relevant, understanding it as timely, and understanding it as local.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kate?
So there was a moment when I thought maybe you were looking at my paper, but I don't think that you were. So first of all, I want to say that today you'll hear from me kind of a tale of two commonwealths. Yes, two commonwealths. So as I talk about both the work that we're doing in higher ed at Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, but also in my time at Kentucky Center for Statistics, or KY Stats. And so I'm so drawn by this question that, I wanted to write down just a really quick, what does this mean to me when we really talk about data use at local? And this is what I thought you were reading from my paper, but my handwriting is very small, so I don't think so. I said, when we think about data use at the local level, we're talking about meeting them where they are and empowering them with access to high quality, timely, actionable data.
Bam.
So I think we can all agree upon that. Put it up on the board. But I thought that I would actually give you all just a few anecdotes. So I was so excited to hear the really great news about what KY Stats is doing right now. It's so exciting to hear about the work and to hear many of you who are collaborating with them, but not even in their office, talk about this work. But I want to talk about the first time we ever linked high school and post-secondary data, unit level data. So I appreciate I love the panel before this talking about the linking the data. So now we have to ask ourselves, will they come, right? Are they actually going to use this data? So we had to get up very early because there was some server issues that when you got to about 9 a.m., things just really slowed down. So this is about 2011. I was the original research analyst on the P20W grant, and it was called Kentucky P20 Data Collaborative at the time. So we got together and we're working on this 37-step matching algorithm. How many people are we going to get when we put these together, So we did this report in Crystal Reports. True story, off of our stitched together SQL server. And we produced our first high school feedback report. And then I had the honor of sending it to every superintendent in the state, okay, because this was our data sharing agreement, and asked them to validate it, because that's what we were doing then. So I sent this to these wonderful individuals. When you talk about local, they knew their students. They knew who these, and again, we're talking about, using proper data suppression. All of that, of course, was in place. But I started getting these really heated emails about they were confident and they knew all of their students that, in fact, were at Yale, they were at Harvard, and they knew them by name. And it just so happens that some of those institutions weren't participating in one of the ways that we were getting data at the time. So the next year, so after this series of emails and me walking people through individually through this, principals, I had parents call me, letting me know for their official record where their student was in college. It was great. And again, this is 2011. It feels like a lifetime ago. Maybe it was. So the next year, again, we hear a lot of good news stories from KY Stats. So now that I'm a little bit more removed, I thought I'd tell the story. So the next year, we did it very differently. I started by going to all of the superintendent co-op meetings. Hi, I'm Kate. I'm Kentucky Kate. And let me tell you a story that may be helpful to you. So we went through superintendent group by superintendent group. They asked all kinds of questions. I did not mention the prior year. I probably should have changed my name, but I didn't. But through this really collaborative exercise, we really actually changed the high school feedback report because now we knew what they were looking for. We were just showing all the things that we could link together. Not helpful. So what was really helpful for them, their teachers, they heard, really wanted to hear things. They wanted to see information like GPA by math for math classes for your last 2 years of high school compared to your first year in post-secondary. They wanted to see What is the comparison and grading scores? And information like that we had never considered. We didn't know how accurate GPA information was, weren't really sure, but they were confident that this was information that they really wanted to use to compare. And then not only that, they wanted to use it to really drive locally better data quality. So when we think about really using this data at the local level, it has to begin with those really using the data. And I love the concept of, sitting in Frankfurt at the time or sitting now, in a system office for a public 4-year state-owned 10 institutions. We don't have students in the system office, and we didn't have students, and they still don't at KY Stats, to my knowledge. And thinking about really connecting with those practitioners at the local level. I think the same is really true also when we think about the workforce sector. So we could produce, I loved hearing all of, thinking about from a state level what this means locally. And then you ask the workforce boards and really trying to figure out what's helpful for them, right? How can we help them be invested in the work and thinking about connecting education to workforce, and even also into health and human service data. So as we think about what that really means locally, I think it's really driven from those practitioners in particular. Now they don't know what they don't know, right? We love to say that. But opening up those doors and that conversation, I think was really meaningful when we think about driving change in education and workforce policy, even understanding what the constituents are saying from the legislators that you're trying to connect with, and helping to bring the voice that's really needed in that work.
Thank you for
I'm sorry
airing
about
out
the
Kentucky's
story.
dirty laundry.
See me
So we
afterwards
appreciate
for
that.
more. I at least said I did it, right? I didn't say and then Jessica.
Adam, would you like to respond? I know you're itching to.
Sure. So on this question. No? It's not on? Okay, apparently. Well, see, this one's got more gain, right? Because everyone knows that my voice is not terribly loud. What's been instrumental in promoting the use of data at the local level? Well, I'm going to tell you, I've been in the workforce system in Texas for it'll be 20 years next month, and 2 months. And I'll tell you how it started. It started the way that it starts, I think, in most places, which is it was compliance activity, right? It was you create performance measures and you set expectations, and those measures are designed to change behavior, and basically people start changing their behavior and using the data to support that effort because they don't want to get hit over the head with a stick, okay? That's the reality of the situation. We change behavior by creating incentives and positive and negative incentives around performance measures and setting escalating targets over time. But while that certainly worked in terms of what we were trying to do, which was serve more employers and help UI claimants return to work faster and save money into our trust fund and things like that, at the end of it, that really wasn't necessarily, that was kind of a first step on a journey. So we needed to get past that and get beyond the point of just trying to top-down change behavior with measures and things like that, and start trying to empower the locals to use data to actually complete the mission, right? So we may have built these measures around the idea of, well, we're supposed to serve employers, we're supposed to get people back to work. That's mission related, and it's true, but it's not really what the mission is per se, right? There's a lot more that we're supposed to accomplish at my agency, certainly. We have too many programs. And so what we started thinking about is the question of relevance of our system and the question of using data to tell stories so that people would understand what the system was and wasn't capable of accomplishing, and why people should or shouldn't partner with us in terms of the initiatives that they were undertaking in economic development. So that local labor market information, sure, they might want some of that with us, but also having us to the table as a training provider or a training partner to help with those large projects that we could hopefully attract to the areas and things like that. And then going beyond that and inculcating this culture of this true data culture, and doing that by tying the idea of data to mission, right? That we are a support function. Data is a support function. That's why we exist. I mean, we used to exist only for compliance purposes to keep the feds off our back, right? Because they fund us mostly. But ultimately, the real key is that the data is the untapped resource. It's our history, it's our present, it can inform our future, it's everything that we can learn from so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and we actually can measure the impact of the changes we're trying to make in the future. So it was really quite critical, both at our state level and our local level, that we began to help people understand that that's really what data was all about, was that it was their opportunity to actually better serve the people in the local communities, the employers in the communities, and ultimately in our system, the way we think about it, and quite honestly, if you serve people, if you serve employers, if you serve communities, doesn't matter what government organization or service organization you're in the prosperity business, guys, right? That's what we're all about. And I heard it said over and over without using that word, but over and over today, that's what the underlying message was. And so ultimately, what we've started pushing is this idea of data for prosperity. And we're the support function that's going to help accelerate the prosperity impact of our system.
Thank you. So Adam alluded a little bit to the next question, and it's really around fostering a data culture, not only at the local level, but at the state level. And so I'd like to hear, Kate, we'll come back to you, on what advice would you offer to others to foster a data culture, and what are some of the most significant challenges in doing so?
You want more challenges? I want to start by saying that I really think for the journey at KY Stats and also where we are in Pennsylvania, it's really thinking about listening. So that listening really informs these use cases, understanding where the gaps are. I heard Josh Hawley from, I believe, The Ohio State University say earlier, these edge cases, right? So when we're thinking about what these gaps are, what these opportunities are, when you have a leader and they're able to see that, they remember that board meeting, they remember that conversation where they said, you realize they didn't have access to that information, and when you follow back up with them, and now all of a sudden they understand. They understand what it means to have access to linked longitudinal data between agencies, between states, and they no longer need you to make the case as to why that's valuable, because you just solved something for them. And now all of a sudden they understand really what the power is of that information, and then they have a lot more questions. I think some of the challenges with that, we heard a lot of those in the first panel on data linkages. And I think back to one of my favorite questions. We had a new cabinet secretary, and I had just made the great case about how we needed to keep KY Stats, and it was excellent. And he said, great, solve the supply-demand problem in Kentucky. Great. So I think that, when leaders in particular know that all of this data exists, it feels very simple, right? Sure, you just link that up and tell us what's missing. No problem. Problem solved. Sounds like a dashboard to me. So we did make a dashboard, though. We just didn't solve it, right? We let them, because we wanted to empower local leaders and local to really solve that within their communities. It's not really something coming from the state. So as I think about building this data culture, similar to the local, and what I say, it's about meeting them where they are. So if you have leaders, strong leaders in your state that are really excited about data, find a gap for them and something that you can really solve. Help them connect with their colleagues throughout the state, understanding how these linkages can help support multi-agency goals.
Great. I started with Kate, George, so that you couldn't read her notes. So it's your turn now.
Well, because I couldn't read her notes, let me start from a different angle. I think that, well, there are two pieces I can commend to you. One is in the Harvard Data Science Review, it's a value-driven approach to building data infrastructures. And the second one is the one that Julia has mentioned, reimagining labor market information. And those two pieces together make the argument that for a sort of a data ecosystem, an infrastructure to be successful, it needs to demonstrate value in a relatively short period of time. And so this is different than, going to the local owners. The local folks have said, this is what we need. And so how do you proceed from that point? And I think for too long, it's been the case of a very siloed, okay, how do I do this? And I would argue that the value of the collaboratives is the fact that we share very readily code, tools, data analytic expertise. An example, I'm talking to Robert, actually right before this session. Illinois worked with several states to develop the unemployment to reemployment portal. Robert takes a look at it, he says, you know what, I want to take that and I want to develop a set of dashboards based on feedback from my local workforce boards. So what Robert and I talked about, 20 minutes ago was, Robert, what's the status of those dashboards? Because I want to take them to my RESEA people. So now we've moved from a discussion on UI claimants to program participant outcomes. That's how I feel we need to build a data culture, where I pick up the phone and I call Robert. Brian's doing the same thing in Wisconsin. He's developing another aspect of it. I want to see it so I can take it back to my local workforce board folks and say, does this make sense? If so, it's already built. If not, let's adjust it, and I'm going to send those back to Robert. I'm going to send them back to Brian. So I think that there's a part of that data culture that sits with us, and our ability to collaborate with our peers, our colleagues, to build that culture from kind of an infrastructure perspective.
Great. Adam, any advice or challenges?
A couple things. First, I just have to note that, Robert, you and I need to get together because I built kind of what you're talking about because I was inspired by what Illinois did. Yeah. Like, I loved their model for storytelling in terms of the unemployment to reemployment, but I said what I need is I need the ability for my local boards to be able to run this thing and then click a download button and get a list of those claimants who haven't gone back to work yet with contact information and information about their occupation and their industries and where they're located so that they can be outreach served and helped back to work. Yeah. And so we copied the total concept and it has a lot of the same features, but we did not ultimately use exactly the same code. And again, that gets to the whole idea of the network effect and the sharing of ideas, that it's not just about sharing code. It's we're all solving the same problems, right? We just sometimes have our own unique pieces of the solution. Mm-hmm. But you were copying my notes this time, so, because you were talking about speed to...
Look, man, I'm going to sit over by Jessica, okay? And the two of you can just hang out it.
So you were talking about speed to value, and that was absolutely what I was going to get into, is we have to get to speed to value, speed to impact of what we're doing, right? If you want to establish your data culture, look, some people get lucky. I got my job by walking into my executive director's office without any notice, without any appointment, without any clue that I was going to do this, and just knocking on the door and saying, "You got a sec?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "The agency needs a division that's a center for business intelligence. I need to run it, and I need to be a direct report to you." And he slapped his hand on the table. I mean, this is 5 minutes of conversation, and said, "We're doing it." That's it. Now, if you're not so lucky to be able to do that, like, because once I was at the table, once you have data at the table while all the big decisions are being made, instead of a year and a half later after the initiative is over and they didn't bother to collect any damn data, except for the normal stuff, and you can't evaluate it, and you can't prove that it worked or didn't work, right? You're set. So how do we get there? Because the reality is a lot of folks, the data people are a couple levels down from the decision makers. And so you're trying to find some, basically some allies within the program world who are interested in finding ways to have a bigger impact out with, you know, in terms of who you're serving. And you ask them about a problem that they're trying to solve, and you look for small wins and quick wins. And you have to recognize that good enough is good enough to start. Demonstrate some value. Make sure that whatever those early projects are, that you can actually quantify the impact of what you're doing. Because again, that starts to sell up the chain and start people realizing the value proposition of what you're doing and how your work is not taking away from program, right? Because it's a zero-sum game. No one's giving us more money. I mean, I recognize we do have a lot of funders here who have invested in us, but we're mostly using that money for infrastructure, right? But for a lot of the research and the ongoing activities and the improvements and the experiments and things like that, like, that's coming probably out of agency budgets in many instances. And so there really is a struggle there, I think, historically, and especially since most data shops grew out of a compliance reporting function. It was always about finding the way to get that compliance for the absolute minimum dollars possible so that you could maximize dollars for other things. So that is really kind of my big piece on that. But the one other thing that I wanted to talk about is that data culture is not just about within our organizations. It is within our communities, the customers that we serve, and that they need to have the data culture. And this gets back to something that they were talking about on the funders panel. And knowing who your customers are, knowing what their problems are, knowing how to communicate with them about their about what value you are going to bring them. There was a lot of conversation about, like, for employers, because they have data that we want. Well, what can we do with that data? Well, some of the stuff we can do with it, of course, is career pathways and helping ensure that people get that they're going to be able to find workers in the future, and all that's great. But that stuff's kind of theoretical, and it's going to take years to do. You know what I can do right now? You give me occupational title, I can reduce UI fraud in the state overnight, because I have one more data point. Fraudster may not know what this person does for a living. Has his social security number, has date of birth, has a lot of stuff. May not know, so they put in salesman or something like that. It's like, this guy's a computer programmer. I'm going to flag this thing. I'm going to stop the payment. I'm going to move, you know, right? So immediate payoff for the employers. So there's lots of ways to get there in terms of demonstrating the value. But understanding what speaks to them, that's the key to building this up. And they're going to want to play, because they're going to realize there's an immediate impact, and you got to plan for a long-range impact. You deliver now, they'll trust you to deliver more later.
So before I ask this next question, Kate, Adam, move your notes down a seat. And Kate, I'll start with you. So forget about the state borders. How do you scale through data use in a regional kind of network?
So if you'll think about earlier, maybe you all didn't notice this. Whenever they mentioned the Eastern State or the Eastern States Collaborative, they didn't mention Pennsylvania. But then Jessica so kindly mentioned that we are, in fact, part of the Eastern States. And I think one of the things that's really kept us maybe more mentally than anything from participating is our lack of a statewide longitudinal data system. There isn't one in Pennsylvania, if you're not aware of that. There's no linked multi-agency data outside of systems like ours at the higher ed system, where we do connect into labor and industry and into K-12. But there is no centralized system. So I think that what this work, and I think these conversations the past several days, as well as kind of an ongoing conversation about what can we offer. And I think that, we're, I don't know when the day will come that we do have a fully functional SLDS system in Pennsylvania, and I don't think it's going to look like KY Stats. So what can we do now to begin really thinking about how do we really inform the work that we're doing by sharing data really as we think about kind of this eastern states on that side? And so thinking about some of the questions that I'm hearing them from our legislature. I hear them from our universities that we work and that we support with, and we're really interested in things like community college transfer pathways across state lines. So Pennsylvania, fairly large population state, right, has a lot of interest in understanding what's going on in New Jersey, Maryland, New York even, and thinking about our students that are quickly moving across state lines. And understanding we have a hard enough time really capturing just the community college to four-year pipeline, but thinking about the challenge of that across state lines, I think it may have been one of the things that kept us from just jumping in and really being excited about this work. But I think that the time is now. The time is now because now we can also inform our data practices within our state by understanding what's really needed to share and really prioritizing those based on the real gaps that we see. I really liked, I think it was Raj from the University of Kentucky earlier that called this a collective exercise. So as I think about the questions that my wonderful colleagues have asked today, as well as all of the panelists in the conversations, thinking about some of those gaps, and I'm thinking in my head, no wait, we do. We actually have some of this data, right? Even without waiting for this perfect system to just land in our laps, and now we can really collaborate. So as we think about what those real opportunities may be, I think that for states like Pennsylvania that don't have this really rich history of data, like my friends up here, this really gives us an opportunity to really focus on what those gaps are, what those edge cases are, again, and then think about where those opportunities really lie. So I think that as we think about what that future holds, rather than us waiting for our systems to really be there before we can participate, to me, I think that it makes sense just to think about letting that work actually inform what's happening within the Commonwealth.
Great. George?
No, go ahead.
So I'm really glad that you made the comment about, but it's going to be a long time before I have a perfect system. Because you know something? You're never going to have a perfect system. You're never going to have it. If you're waiting for perfection, you're going to retire. And someone else is going to be waiting for perfection. So, you got to make do with good enough and then hope that you can get it to good and, keep progressing from there over time. It's all incrementalism anyway, and then the technology is going to change, right? Remember 10 years ago, SQL was the thing, now it's Python, right? So we're rebuilding everything. I think we've had a couple examples of how we scale and work across the multi-state data collaboratives. The conversation about how there are several states that have used or worked off of KY Stats or added their data into KY Stats. That is an example. The Illinois model that Robert is trying to recreate and I recreated, and perhaps others as well have been inspired by, has been another way to do it. But I think it's more than that. I think that it's also this commitment to, the idea that maybe we're going to work on a thing by ourselves, but because we're part of this network and we're committed to the idea that we're partners in this thing, we're going to share the results anyway, right? So right now, the Gates Foundation has been good enough to fund kind of a wish item of mine, which is I kind of had this idea that if I go up to 10,000 feet, every program looks exactly the same. They are all the same data, right? So you have a person, and that person has characteristics that don't change, like their date of birth. And then they have characteristics that do change, like maybe their education level or their veteran status, and so you have to update those over time. And then you got some eligibility information. Then you've got service delivery, so different types of services being provided in different ways at different places by different people. Then when you're done with that and the period of service is over, there's some type of outcome measurement. And a lot of this kind of looks the same, doesn't it? I mean, I realize the programs have different eligibility. I realize they intend to serve different populations. But at the end of the day, the data looks really, really, really similar. And you can measure the outcomes in very similar ways. And so what we're doing is we've built a common data model and called Rosetta because, you know, I was feeling Egyptian at the time. And we have completed the first suite of dashboards that are built on this common data model of roughly 14 tables. We have something in the neighborhood of 20 some odd measures on 6 dashboards that are available right now. We are in the process of cloning that, and it covers like 20 some odd programs. And we're in the process of cloning it to work with vocational rehabilitation, adult education, and subsidized childcare. So we're going to be looking at this in terms of the parents of the of the kids in care and what's happening with them in terms of earnings and outcomes. And as soon as we're done, open source, baby. It's going out there, and we're going to go on the road, and we're going to make sure that people have access to it through the network and for anybody else who's interested.
Great. Final thoughts, George, to wrap us up
Quickly?
quickly.
Oh, okay. The fact that you asked that question, I don't know of another stakeholder in the national statistical system for which that question would be asked. And the fact that we are sitting here actively talking about how do we innovate and the importance of speed to value as hallmarks of what we do with one another, I think speaks to the uniqueness and the importance of the collaborative effort. So I would say that how we go about collaborating with one another is important, but as well the role of the philanthropic organizations, the role of USDOL. Many of us use WDQI grant money to actually promote innovation. And the UI Equity Grant that several states are working on together. Bringing that all into a collaborative environment is what leverages the innovation aspect. So I would like to just note the uniqueness of the question that you're asking for what we do. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Join me in a round of applause for the panelists.